She was adding sod to the outside of her shelter in the middle of January at -20 degrees. That was what he saw from the road. Cormac Daly was riding the Platte River Trace from his claim to the Meridian trading post, the 14-mile ride he made every third week through the winter when he needed flour and when the cold was not so absolute that the horse refused the work, and he had been riding past the Callahan claim for 3 months without stopping, because the Callahan claim had been, since October, a source of ongoing settlement commentary, and he was a man who preferred not to involve himself in ongoing and commentary. But she was outside at -20 degrees, adding sod to the outside of her shelter, and he was a man who could not ride past that without stopping. He stopped. She looked up at him from where she was working. She was 38 years old and Irish, and she had been a widow since August, when Seamus Callahan had gone into the ground on the north side of the claim, with the cholera that had come up the Platte River that summer, like a debt collector with a list. She was working with the flat-faced spade, cutting sod in the frozen January ground, cutting it the way you cut sod when you knew how, which was a thing she had known since she was a girl in County Clare, and she was stacking the cut sod blocks against the outer wall of her structure with the careful placement of a woman who was doing something she had thought about before doing. He said, "Mrs. Callahan." She said, "Mr. Daly." He said, "It is -20 degrees." She said, "I know what it is." He looked at the structure she was adding to. He had seen it in various stages since August, but he had not fully absorbed it until this moment, seeing it in January with the sod she was adding, making the outer profile change. It was not a cabin. It was not a soddy in the ordinary sense, the ordinary four-wall sod construction that most of the Kansas Territory settlers built when they could not afford timber. The walls that were adequate and that the old-timers said were better than wood in the summer and tolerable in the winter. It was a mound, not quite a mound, a structure that was on its way to looking like a mound. A long, low shape, barely 5 feet tall at the ridge, with walls that were already 3 feet thick before she was adding to them now. Walls that had gone up in September and October in a configuration that the settlement had watched and had formed opinions about. Opinions that were consistent with the opinions formed about everything else Eowulf Callahan had done since Seamus died, and the settlement had concluded that grief had affected her. Judgment. The settlement was not wrong that her judgment had been affected. Her judgment had been affected in the specific way that the death of a husband on a Kansas homestead in August, with the winter coming, affected a woman's judgment. It made her think more clearly than she had ever thought in her life, with the clear thinking of a person who has had every option but one removed, and who therefore does not spend energy considering the options that no longer exist. She had one option. The option was the 160 acres of Seamus's claim, the claim that was theirs by the Homestead Act, and that would be theirs in fact only if she survived to prove it up, and proving it up required surviving the winter, and surviving the winter required a shelter that could be heated with the wood available to her, which was almost none, because the Callahan claim was on the treeless Kansas prairie where wood cost money at the trading post, and money was a thing she had almost none of. Either she had the sod, she had the flat-faced spade, and she had the sod, and she had the knowledge she had carried from County Clare, the knowledge of earth and what it did and what it did not do when you treated it correctly, and she had the specific knowledge she had used to think through the winter with the same rigor she had applied to every difficult thing in her life, which was to start from what she knew was true and work forward from there without skipping steps. She knew the ground temperature. She knew it from digging the grave in August, the way you knew ground temperature from the work of the spade at different depths. Cold at the surface in winter, less cold at 1 foot, warmer at 2 feet, and at 4 feet, the same temperature as the inside of a cool cellar, the temperature of the ground that had been below the frost line for its entire existence, the temperature that did not answer to the season above. She knew the sod. She knew that 3 feet of wet prairie sod was better insulation than 6 inches of cottonwood plank, because she had slept in sod structures and wood structures in her years on the Platte, and she knew the specific warmth of sod in the way you knew something from sleeping in it. The sod held, the wood let go. The wood let the cold in because the wood was thin and the cold was patient. The sod held because the sod was thick and full of the air trapped in its fiber, and because 3 feet of anything between you and -20 was 3 feet of protection in a way that 6 inches was not. She knew the volume. She knew that a room you did not have to heat did not require wood. A small room required less wood than a large room. The lowest room you could live in without bowing your head was a room that held less cold air than a room with a proper ceiling. You heated the air in the room. The less air in the room, the less heating required. She had worked through this arithmetic in the September evenings after she had buried Seamus, sitting at the table that was not yet the table in the structure she was going to build, but was still the table in the temporary camp shelter, and the arithmetic had produced a number. A room 12 feet long, 9 feet wide, with a 6-foot ceiling, had a volume of 648 cubic feet, and that volume, inside walls 3 feet thick, with a floor sunk 2 feet into the ground, could be maintained at 55 degrees through a Kansas winter on approximately a cord and a half of wood. She had a cord and 3/4. The structure she built in September and October was the structure the arithmetic required, not the structure dignity required, not the structure ambition required, not the structure that signaled to the Platte River settlement that the Callahan widow was managing fine and had prospects. The structure survival required. It was 12 feet long and 9 feet wide, with walls of stacked sod 3 feet thick, a low-pitched cottonwood pole roof she had salvaged from the driftwood at the river bend, covered in sod and prairie grass, a 6-foot interior ceiling, and a floor dug 2 feet below the surrounding grade. The door was on the south side, the only side that faced the sun, a door of cottonwood planks she had shaped with the draw knife, hung low and fitted tight. 2 windows, each 1 foot square, set high in the east and west walls to catch cross-ventilation in summer and sealed with oiled cloth in winter. A stone-rimmed fire pit in the center of the floor, not a stove, a fire pit, because a stove required metal and metal cost money, and stone was free at the creek 3 miles east. From outside it looked like a grass mound with a door. That was what the settlement said. Thomas Greer said it first, in October, when he rode past and stopped and looked at the finished structure and looked at Oifer, who was packing the last of the autumn sod blocks against the upper walls, and said, "Mrs. Callahan, what is that?" She said, "My winter shelter." He said, "It looks like a hill with a door." She said, "Yes." He looked at it for a long time. Thomas Greer was 53, a land speculator from Ohio who had come to Kansas Territory in 1860 with enough capital to buy the claims of settlers who failed and enough patience to wait for them to fail, and who had been watching the Callahan claim since August with the patient attention of a man who understood that a widow on a Kansas homestead in the autumn was a specific kind of opportunity if properly waited for. He had made his offer in September, $40 for the 160 acres and the improvements, which he had presented as a generous offer given the circumstances, and she had told him in the specific Irish way of a woman who had made her decision that she was not selling. He had said he would check back in spring. He had said this in the way that men said things they intended to prove. He looked at the structure now and said, "You cannot heat that through a Kansas winter on the wood you have." She said, "I believe I can." He said, "There is no stove. There is no chimney." She said, "There is a fire pit." He said, "A fire pit is not a stove." She said, "No, it is not a stove." He said, "You will freeze in January." She said, "I will let you know in February." He rode on. He told people at the Meridian trading post that the Callahan widow had built a fool's burrow and would be dead by January. and the word fool's burrow attached to the structure the way words attached when they had the sound of a thing that seemed true, and the settlement took it up. And by November, when the cold came in from the north, the Callahan widow's fool's burrow was a fixture of settlement conversation, the way any anticipated disaster was a fixture, anticipated with a mixture of certainty and the specific guilt of anticipated certainty. She went inside and did what she had built the structure to do. She survived. The first serious cold came in November, the cold that ran -12 and stayed for a week, and that tested every dwelling in the Platte River settlement against its first real demand. She had built the morning fire in the stone ring, the small fire, the fire of a woman who had rationed wood since September and who knew the count of every piece in the stack against the east wall. The fire that was sized not for comfort, but for adequacy, the fire that brought the interior from its overnight temperature of 53 to a morning temperature of 61, and that she would manage down to coals by noon and not rebuild until evening. She pressed her hand to the sod wall at 7 in the morning with the fire at its peak, 58 degrees, not the fire's heat, the sod's own temperature, the sod that had been in contact with the ground at 53 degrees and had been wrapped on the outside by more sod and more sod, until the 3 feet of it held the ground's temperature independent of what the Kansas air was doing above the frost line. 58 degrees in the sod wall at 7 in the morning, in November at -12 outside. She wrote this in the journal she had started keeping in September, the journal she had not planned to keep, but that had become the record of the arithmetic she was doing, the daily accounting of what the structure was and what it cost and what it returned. November 9th, outside, -12. Wall temperature morning, 58. Floor temperature, 54. Air temperature before fire, 53. Air temperature at peak fire, 61. Wood used, 3 pieces oak, 40 minutes. Evening fire, same. Total wood, 6 pieces. 6 pieces of oak in a day at -12. She had 600 pieces remaining. She did the arithmetic with the November entries every Sunday, and the arithmetic continued to confirm what she had designed. The structure was doing what the structure was supposed to do. The sod walls held. The sunken floor held the ground temperature. The small volume of the interior meant the small fire was sufficient. She was not warm in the way that comfort required. She was warm in the way that survival required, which was the warmth of a woman who had made the correct calculation and who was living inside the correct calculation every day and finding it confirmed. She was not comfortable. She was not miserable either. She was doing what she had come to Kansas to do, making the land yield what it had. The land here had no wood and had no stone worth building with except at the creek, and the creek was 3 miles east. The land had sod. 3 feet of deep-rooted prairie sod, covering every inch of the 160 acres, sod that the settlers had been turning since 1860, and that had proven to be the specific resource that the Kansas prairie offered instead of timber. The substitute that was worse in some ways and better in others, worse because it was heavy and wet and degraded in the rain, and better because it was everywhere and it was free and it was per inch of thickness, a better insulator than anything you could build from cottonwood. She had not invented the sod structure. Every settler on the Platte knew what a soddy was. The soddy was the standard first-year shelter, 4 sod walls and a grass roof and an iron stove ordered from the St. Louis catalog, the basic unit of Kansas Territory settlement. The soddy kept you alive in an ordinary winter if the stove was adequate and the wood supply was adequate. What she had built was different from the soddy in 3 ways that mattered. The first difference was the wall thickness. A standard soddy had walls 18 to 24 inches thick, which was the thickness you got when you laid sod in the standard double-row block pattern. She had built 3 rows, 3 feet of sod, because the arithmetic said 3 feet, and the arithmetic was what she was following. The second difference was the floor. A standard soddy had a floor at ground level, which meant the floor was cold because the surface ground in Kansas was cold in winter, below freezing in January and February. Her floor was 2 feet below grade, 2 feet below the frost penetration level, which put the floor in contact with ground that stayed above 50 degrees, regardless of the air temperature above. The third difference was the height. A standard soddy was built as tall as a person stood, 7 feet or more, because dignity and comfort required a certain ceiling height, and because the settlers came from places where adequate height was the norm. Her ceiling was 6 feet, because 6 feet was the height she could maintain without stooping on her way through the door, and because the arithmetic said that every foot of unnecessary ceiling height was cubic feet of air that required heating that did not need to be heated. These three differences together were the thing that the settlement could not see from outside, because from outside the structure looked like a foolishness, too low, too thick, too odd. The three differences were visible only from inside, in the 53 degrees at midnight in January, in the cord and a half of wood that would last to April. December came. The cold in December ran serious, the cold that settled in from the north and stayed, not the specific catastrophe of January, but the preparatory cold of a winter that was building to something. She managed the fire by the numbers in the journal, the daily entries, the wood count, the wall temperature, the floor temperature, the air temperature at peak fire and at midnight and at the morning before the first fire. December 1st, outside -4. Wall temperature 57, floor 53, midnight temperature 50, wood per day 7 pieces. December 15th, outside -9. Wall 56, floor 52, midnight 49, wood per day 8 pieces. December 21st, outside -16, wall 55, floor 52, midnight 48, wood per day 9 pieces, 48 degrees at midnight in December at -16 outside. She did not find 48 degrees comfortable. She found it survivable. She slept in the wool blanket and the quilt she had made from Seamus's coats, the quilt that was the specific warmth of a woman who had repurposed grief into insulation, and at 48 degrees in the wool and the quilt she was warm enough to sleep. She was alive. This was the accounting. It was in December that Cormac Daly stopped the first time, the stop that was not the January stop with the sod, but an earlier stop, a December stop when he was riding the Platte Trace to the trading post and saw the smoke coming from the low structure and stopped because the smoke was coming from a hole in the roof rather than from a chimney pipe, and he had not noticed before that there was no chimney pipe. She came out when she heard the horse. He said, "Mrs. Callahan, there is no chimney." She said, "The smoke goes through the roof vent." He said, "A hole in the roof." She said, "A fitted vent in the roof." She showed him the sliding bark cover she had made for the vent, the same principle she had used to cover the fire pit when the fire was out, keeping the heat in when the fire was gone, and opening the vent when the fire was burning. A chimney, she explained, was a pipe that took the warm air and the smoke out together. The warm air was what you were trying to keep. A vent of the correct size took the smoke and left most of the warm air. He said, "The smoke fills the interior." She said, "Come inside." He came inside, ducking through the low door, and stood in the interior and looked around. His eyes went to the stone ring at the center and the small fire in it, and the smoke that rose from the fire and went to the ceiling, and, instead of filling the ceiling, the way smoke filled an interior without a chimney, funneled through the vent opening, the draft pulling it cleanly up and out. He looked at the walls. He looked at the floor, 2 feet below the entrance step. He pressed his hand against the sod wall. He said, "Warm." She said, 57 this morning before the fire." He said, "The sod." She said, 3 feet of sod. The ground temperature is 53 degrees at 2 feet depth. The sod is connected to the ground. The wall is connected to the ground. The ground does not care what December is doing above it. He pressed his hand deeper against the sod surface, the way people pressed when they were surprised by what they felt and were verifying. He said, "You dug down." She said, 2 feet. The floor is 2 feet below the surface. The floor temperature is 52 degrees all winter. He said, and the ceiling. She said 6 feet. She stood straight and her head cleared the ceiling by 3 inches, her Irish height exactly right for the dimension she had chosen. She said, 64 cubic feet, less air to heat for every foot of ceiling I don't need. She paused. I don't need 7 feet of ceiling. I need 6. He looked at the interior of the 12 by 9 space, the small space, the space that looked from inside like a room that had decided to be honest about its requirements. He said, "How warm at peak fire." She said, 61, sometimes 62 on the coldest mornings when I build it up. He said, and wood. She said, 8 pieces per day in December. She showed him the stack. He counted it without being asked, the way practical men counted things, and did the arithmetic. He said, "You will have a quarter cord remaining in April." She said, "That is my estimate." He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the vent in the ceiling, the simple rectangle of fitted bark that was closed now, with the fire going, the smoke pulling through the narrow gap she had calculated for the draft. He said, "How did you know the vent size?" She said, "I did not know. I estimated, and I was wrong twice." She pointed to the 2 plugged holes in the ceiling, the failed experiments. She said, "The first was too large, and the smoke backed into the room. The second was too small, and the fire would not draw." She pointed to the current vent. "This one is 4 inches by 8 inches, which is correct for the fire size I burn at this ceiling height." He said, "You cut 3 holes in your own roof." She said, "Yes." He said, "In November." She said, "In October." "The first 2 in October, this one in November." She paused. I needed to know before the serious cold came. He looked at her. He said, "You planned this before you built it." She said, "I planned everything before I built it." She went to the shelf on the east sod wall, the shelf she had packed into the sod block at the 3rd course, a naturally integrated shelf that was one of the small satisfactions of sod construction. The shelf was part of the wall was the shelf. There was no distinction. She took down the journal and opened it to the September pages, the planning pages, the pages before there was anything to record, and when the only entries were the calculations, dimensions, wall thickness, floor depth, volume, wood requirement, draft equations. She gave him the journal. He read the September pages, standing in the center of the room with the fire at his back. He was a farmer from County Cork, which she had not known until that moment, and a County Cork farmer reading a County Clare woman's arithmetic about sod and heat and survival was reading something that was not entirely foreign to him. He read without speaking for a time. He said, "You calculated the draft." She said, "I tried. The calculation was approximate. The experiments corrected it." He said, "You calculated the wood requirement in September." She said, "Yes." He said, "And it has held." She said, "So far." She paused. "Ask me in April." He gave her back the journal. He said, "You have thought about this more carefully than anyone I have met in Kansas Territory." She said, "I have had to." He said, "Yes." He did not say anything more about the Fool's Burrow. He rode to the trading post, and he said nothing at the trading post about the Callahan claim, because he was a man who had decided not to involve himself in the settlement commentary, and he had come back from his visit with a different basis for the decision. January came. January was the winter's intention. The temperature dropped on the 3rd of January and kept dropping for 12 days without a decision to stop. The cold of a Kansas January that had made up its mind. The cold that ran -22 and -28. And then, on the 11th day, -34. the temperature that the settlement at the Meridian trading post had not seen in the 3 years since the first homesteaders had arrived, and that the old-timers in the territory who had been on the Platte since the 1840s said was the worst since the winter of 1856. She was inside the structure. She knew the temperature was catastrophic from 3 signs. The water in the clay jug by the door had a skim of ice on it in the morning, the first time this had happened since October. The blanket she hung over the inside of the door, her second insulation against the cold that came under the door despite the fitted threshold, was stiff in the morning. And the ground squirrel that had been living in the east corner of the floor since November, and that she had been tolerating, because a ground squirrel in the floor corner was evidence that the floor was warm enough for a ground squirrel, and a ground squirrel was evidence that she was not entirely alone, came out of its corner on the morning of the 11th day and pressed itself against her leg while she was building the morning fire. She built the fire larger on those 11 days, not large. Larger, 12 pieces of wood instead of 9, 13 on the coldest day, the day the outside temperature was -34, and the wall temperature was 53, and the floor was 49, and the interior at midnight was 44 degrees. 44 degrees. She slept in the coat and the quilt and the blanket, and she was cold. She was specifically cold in the way that 44 degrees is cold for sleeping. She was not in danger of freezing. 44 degrees in a wool coat and a quilt is survivable. She knew this from County Clare, where the stone houses in January were 38 degrees before the fire and 55 after, and where survival was understood to be a number rather than a comfort. She managed the 11 days, the 13th piece of wood on the coldest day, the ground squirrel against her leg in the morning, the ice skim on the water jug. On the 12th day, the temperature rose to -10 and then to -2, and then on the 14th day, it was 8 degrees above zero, and the crisis was over, and she had 411 pieces of wood remaining. She added the 14 crisis days to the journal. She added them and totaled them, and she had used 143 more pieces of wood than her planning calculation had estimated for the same period, the extra consumption of the extreme cold, the 13-piece days. She recalculated. 411 pieces remaining, February and March ahead. Her February estimate was 12 pieces a day, March estimate 9 pieces a day. The estimates from her September planning that had so far run slightly below actual. If February ran 12 and March ran 9, she would need approximately 630 pieces through the 2 remaining months. She had 411. She had a shortfall. She sat with this arithmetic for a time. Then she put down the journal and went outside with the flat-faced spade. That was the second thing about January that people remembered, that on the 15th of January, the day after the worst cold broke, when the temperature was 8 degrees above zero, the Callahan widow was outside adding sod to the outside of her structure. Thomas Greer saw her on the 19th. He was not riding the Platte trace. He had come specifically, the specific coming of a man who had expected a particular thing to have happened and who wanted to confirm it. He came around the low structure from the north and stopped when he saw her cutting sod in the frozen ground and stacking it against the already thick outer wall. He said, "Mrs. Callahan." She did not stop working. She said, "Mr. Greer." He said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm adding to the wall." He said, "In January." She said, "In January." She did not look up. She cut the next sod block and set it against the wall. She said, "The crisis cold showed me where the wall was losing heat." She indicated the north wall. The north wall runs 2 degrees colder than the east and west walls. 2 degrees means a thin section in the sod. She was adding to the north wall specifically 2 more courses of sod blocks across the full north face. She said, "The January crisis cost me 143 pieces of wood I had not planned for. I am buying back the wood by making the north wall thicker." He said, "You are adding insulation in January." She said, "I should have added it in October." I did not know where the thin section was until the crisis showed me. He looked at the north wall, which was now, with the 2 additional courses she had been adding for 4 days, nearly 4 feet thick on the north side. He looked at the structure, the low mound of it, the grass already beginning to grow from the older sod blocks in the way that sod grew when it was laid correctly, and the roots continued. From the south side, the new sod on the north was invisible. From the north, the structure looked more like a hill than it ever had. The door on the south side completely out of sight. Nothing visible from the north face, but a grass-covered wall that merged at the base into the surrounding prairie. He said, "The wall is growing." She said, "The roots are knitting in. That is what sod does when you lay it correctly." She paused. "In 2 years, the north wall will have roots 2 feet deep and the grass will cover the full face. You will not be able to tell where the ground stops and the wall begins." He said, "You are building a hill." She said, "I am building a wall that becomes a hill." "Yes," he said, "for what purpose?" She said, "So that I cannot see where the wall stops and the ground begins, and neither can the January wind." He was quiet. He said, "This was your plan in September." She said, "The knitting in was in my plan, yes. The wall was not planned to be this thick." She paused. January revised the plan. "I am building what January taught me I should have built in October." He looked at her for a long time, the look of a man updating an assessment. He said, "You are not freezing." She said, "I am cold, I am not freezing." He said, "Your wood." She said, "A shortfall." He said, "How much?" She said, "Approximately 200 pieces for February and March if the cold runs as planned." She paused. "I have 411. He said, "You will have surplus." She said, "If February and March are not worse than planned." She cut another sod block. "If they are worse than January was worse than planned, I will add to the south wall in February." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "I came to assess the claim." She said, "I know." He said, "I expected to find it abandoned." She said, "I know." He said, "It is not abandoned." She said, "No." He said, "The structure." She said, "We'll be here in spring." She set the block on the course and pressed it level. She said, "The claim will be here in spring." She paused. "I will be here in spring." He said, "Yes." He said it with the specific deflation of a man whose expectation has been corrected by the thing he came to confirm, the specific sound of a land speculator who has arrived at a property he intended to buy and found it occupied by a woman adding sod to her walls in January. He rode on. She went back to work. That was the January that Cormac Daly saw when he stopped on the Platte Trace, the Callahan widow, outside at -20 degrees, adding to the north wall, the revised arithmetic, the wall that January had taught her to build. He said, "It is -20 degrees." She said, "I know what it is." He said, "You are outside." She said, "The work needs to be done before the hard cold comes back." She set a block. She said, "There is a gap in the north wall." She tapped it with the spade handle, and he heard the difference, the hollow sound of a thin section in an otherwise dense wall. She said, "That is where February will find me if I do not fill it now." He got off the horse. He said, "Show me what to do." She looked at him. He said, "I have ridden past this claim for 3 months." He said it simply, without apology, without the elaborate qualification of a man who was ashamed of something and was not ready to be direct about it. He said, "Show me what to do." She showed him. She showed him the size of the block and the angle of the cut, and the way you set the block so the roots faced down and the grass faced out and the compression between blocks was even on all sides. She showed him the gap that she was filling, the hollow section, and she showed him how to test the wall with the spade handle by the sound. He worked for 3 hours. He was not a mason, and he was not a sod builder, but he was a County Cork farmer, and a County Cork farmer knew how to follow instruction and how to do physical work until it was done. and he filled the gap in the north wall and extended the additional course to the wall's full north face, without stopping except to ask questions that were good questions, the questions of a man who was learning something and not pretending he already knew it. When the section was done, she pressed the spade handle against the finished wall, and the sound was solid, not hollow. He said, "Better." She said, "Yes." He said, "How much better?" She said, "The hollow section was losing the heat of approximately 1 piece of wood per day through the gap." She paused. "Filling it recovers that piece. Over February and March, that is 60 pieces." He said, "60 pieces." She said, "60 pieces is the difference between surplus and shortage." He was quiet. He said, "You count everything." She said, "I count what can be counted." She paused. "What cannot be counted I plan for." He said, "The gap could not be counted." She said, "The gap was a possibility I should have planned for in October." She paused. "I planned for the walls I could see. I did not plan for the section I could not see that the sod had not knitted fully." She looked at the corrected wall. "Now I have seen it. Now it is corrected." He said, "You correct as you go." She said, "I correct when the correction is available." She said, "In October the correction was a different wall thickness. In January the correction is filling the gap and adding the courses." She paused. "If there is a February correction, I will make it in February." He said, "You are not finished building." She said, "I will never be finished building." She said it matter-of-factly, the statement of a woman for whom building was not a project with an end date, but a process with a continuous present. She said, "The sod is alive, the roots are knitting, the grass is growing, the wall changes every month, I change with it." He looked at the north face of the structure, the finished section, the grass beginning to grow from the new sod blocks already in the way that grass grew when the blocks were healthy and the conditions were right. He said, "How long before the roots knit through?" She said, "The first-year blocks are already showing root integration at the mortar lines. By next spring, the north wall will be a continuous living mass. You will not be able to separate one block from the next." He said, "And the heat," she said, "the heat will be held better than it is now. The living roots trap more air than dead sod. Air is the insulation. The roots create more air pockets per cubic inch than dead fiber does." She paused. "The wall will be better in its second year than in its first, and better in its third year than in its second. It is a living wall. It improves." He said, "I did not know sod improved." She said, "Most people treat sod as a material you use until you can afford something better." She looked at the north wall. "I do not intend to use something better. This is what I am building. This is what I am building toward." He got back on the horse. He said, "I will come back in February." She said, "Bring the spade." He came back in February with the spade, and with a half cord of cottonwood he had cut from the river bend on his claim. Wood, he had said nothing about acquiring, and said nothing about giving, except to set it against the south wall of her structure, and unharness the draft horse, and begin stacking it. She came out and looked at the wood. She said, "I did not ask for wood." He said, "I did not say you asked." She said, "It is your wood." He said, "I cut it from my claim. I have enough." He stacked the next piece. He said, "I am putting it here." He paused. "You can count it as a loan if that is easier." She said, "A loan at what rate?" He said, "At the rate of a piece of work that needs doing on my claim that I will ask you to help with in spring." She said, "What work?" He said, "I'm going to build a structure like this one on my claim." He said it while stacking wood, not looking at her. He said, "I have a standard soddy with 18-inch walls and a 7-foot ceiling and a cast-iron stove." He paused. "I used 9 cord last winter." He paused again. "I would like to use 3. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You have seen the journal." He said, "I have seen the journal, and I have spent January doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic says the same thing your arithmetic says." She said, "The design is not a secret." He said, "I know it is not a secret." But the design requires someone who has built it to stand at each course and correct the mistakes I will make. He looked at her. I will make mistakes. I know I will make mistakes. I need someone who has made the mistakes already. She said, in spring. He said, in spring. He set the last piece of the half cord on the stack. He said, this wood is not charity. It is a deposit on spring instruction. She said, I charge a higher rate than a half cord. He said, name it. She said, a full cord in April plus your labor through the summer building season. He said, done. February ran cold, but not January cold. The worst day was -22, which was within her planning range, the planning she had recalculated after January, and she managed it with the corrected north wall and the half cord Daly had brought, and she came through February with 231 pieces remaining. March came, and the cold began its slow withdrawal, the way Kansas winter withdrew, not all at once but in the specific pattern of a negotiation, warm days and cold nights, and then warmer days and less cold nights, and then the morning in the third week of March, when she came out of the structure, and the air was 34 degrees and smelled of the thaw, and the ground was beginning to give at the surface. She had 112 pieces remaining. She did not need them. She had not needed them since the second week of March, when the temperature stopped going below -10 at night. She stacked the remaining pieces against the outer south wall and covered them with oiled cloth and let them be. They would be there in October. Thomas Greer came on the second Tuesday of April. He came with the specific manner he always carried, the manner of a man who presented himself as reasonable and who used reasonableness as a tool for achieving what he wanted, which was the claim. He had not achieved the claim in the winter the way he had expected to achieve it. The winter had failed to perform. He was adjusting. He said, Mrs. Callahan, you have had a hard winter. She said, I have had a winter. He said, the structure. He looked at the north wall, which after the additional January courses and the February knitting had become what she had said it would become, a continuous living mass, the root integration at the block lines, already visible as dense grass, growing straight through what had been the mortar gaps, the wall thicker than any soddy wall he had seen in Kansas territory, and already beginning to look in April less like a structure and more like the earth it was made from. He said, the structure has survived. She said, yes. He said, you have survived. She said, yes. He said, my offer. She said, is not adequate. He said, I am prepared to increase it. She said, to what? He said, $75. She said, no. He said, the claim has no improvements that a buyer would value. The structure is, she said, the structure is 12 feet by 9 feet with 3-foot sod walls and a sunken floor, and will heat on 1.5 cord through a Kansas winter. She said it evenly. She said, the structure is the improvement. The structure is the thing any buyer would pay for. He said, it is a mound. She said, it is a warm mound that costs 1.5 cord a winter to heat. She paused. How much did Peter Strand's place sell for in March? He was quiet. Peter Strand had sold his claim in March after the winter had cost him 11 cord and nearly his life, the sale motivated by the specific demoralization of a man who had understood that the climate and his cabin were not compatible and who had not had the information to understand why until too late. The sale had been for $50, which Greer had paid. She said, you paid $50 for a claim with an 18-inch wall soddy and a 9-cord a winter cast-iron stove. He said, the land. She said, the land is the same land I have. She looked at him. The improvement is the difference. My improvement heats on 1.5 cords and will be here in 30 years, growing better. His improvement would have cost him his life in another hard winter. He said, $100. She said, no. He said, Mrs. Callahan, $100 is... She said, I am not selling. She said it the way she had said it in September and the way she would say it in every future October when he came with a revised number and a patient manner. She said, I am going to prove up this claim. She paused. I am going to build the spring structure next to this one, a larger structure, 12 by 14, with the same wall system and a proper sleeping loft. She paused again. In 2 years, I will have 200 acres of winter wheat, and a claim that is proved up, and a structure that costs a cord and a half a winter, and I will be here, and you will still be buying the claims of people who built the wrong kind of soddy. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the north wall of the structure, the living wall, the roots visible in the April light, the grass growing from every block face, the wall that was becoming the hill that was becoming the prairie. He said, "You know something about sod that other people here do not know." She said, "I know what my grandmother knew in Clare." She paused. "I know what everyone in Clare knew before the famine took it from them, which is that earth is not a substitute for better materials. Earth is what you build with when you understand earth." She looked at the wall. "Most people in Kansas build with sod because they cannot afford wood. I build with sod because sod is what this land offers, and I know what sod does when you treat it correctly." He said, "What does it do?" She said, "It lives." She said it simply. She said, "Wood is dead when you cut it. Stone is never alive. Sod is alive when you cut it, and it continues to live when you build with it, and every year it is more alive than it was the year before, and every year the wall is better than it was the year before." She pressed her palm to the north face of the wall, the April north face with the roots coming through, and the grass growing, and the wall that was 2 degrees warmer in January than it had been in November because the root integration had filled the air gaps with living fiber. She said, "In 10 years this wall will be a continuous prairie mass. You will not be able to take it apart." He said nothing for a moment. He said, "You are planning to be here in 10 years?" She said yes. He rode on. Cormac Daly came in April as he had said he would, with his spade and his notebook in which he had copied the September calculations from the journal, the calculations he had read, standing in the center of the small, warm room in December. He came with the specific readiness of a man who had spent the winter thinking about something and was ready to begin. She showed him how to sort the sod for quality, the test for root density and moisture content, the way you read a cut sod block the way her grandmother had read it in Clare. Root face dark and dense, fiber face pale and tight, the weight per block that told you the moisture was right. She showed him the orientation, the way the blocks went in root face down in the first 3 courses and root face out in the upper courses, where the roots grew outward into the exposed face and knitted the courses together. She showed him the floor excavation, the 2 feet below grade, the way you sloped the floor slightly toward the entrance for drainage, the way you packed the clay subsoil to create a floor that was dense enough to hold the ground temperature and porous enough to breathe. She showed him the vent calculation, the 4 by 8 inch rectangle that had taken 3 experiments to find, and she showed him the 2 failed holes plugged in her own roof and said, "You will make these mistakes also. Make them in September, so you have October to correct them." She showed him the journal and what to measure and when to measure it and what the numbers meant. He built his structure in May and June, the 2-month build that was the correct pace for a structure you intended to live in for 30 years. She came 3 days a week and stood at each course and corrected the mistakes he made, which were the mistakes she had told him he would make, and which he took without resentment because he was a County Cork man learning from a County Clare woman, and he had the specific grace of a person who knew the difference between pride and competence and had chosen competence. On the 7th course, he set a block with the root face inward instead of outward, and she said, "Turn it." He looked at it and said, "Why does the orientation matter?" She said, "The roots grow outward from the block face. If the root face is inward, the roots grow into the interior space." He said, "The interior space is sealed." She said, "The roots will find the seal and breach it." He turned the block. On the 12th course he mortared too wet, and she said, "Too wet." He said, "The block is not setting," she said. "It will set if you let it. Wet mortar fails in the first freeze." He let it dry for a day and came back to the course, and the mortar had set correctly. In June, when the walls were at height and the roof was going on, he said, "You should charge for this." She said, "We agreed on the rate in January." He said, "We agreed on instruction." "This is more than instruction." She said, "This is instruction." She said, "When you build the second one, you will not need me." He said, "What second one?" She said, "The one you build for the family that comes in the spring from County Mayo and has no resources and does not know what sod does and will build the wrong kind of soddy and freeze." He looked at her. She said, "They will come. They have been coming since 1860, and they will keep coming, and most of them will build the wrong kind, and some of them will not survive the wrong kind." She paused. "You will know the right kind. You will show them." He said, "I am not a builder." She said, "You are a County Cork farmer who spent a winter understanding why walls are the difference between surviving and not surviving." She paused. "That is more than most people on this trace have." He finished the structure in July. She came for the first fire, the curing fire, the 3-hour fire that drove the moisture from the mortar and tested the vent draft and charged the floor for the first time. She sat in his finished structure and pressed her palm to the south wall. She said, 55 degrees. He said, "The walls, not the fire." She said, "The walls." She looked at the floor, 2 feet below grade, the packed clay that had been holding the ground temperature since he excavated it in May. She pressed her palm to the floor. She said, 53. He said, "The floor." She said, "Yes." She looked at the structure. His structure, 12 feet by 14, larger than hers, but with the same wall system and the same logic and the same journal, beginning on the shelf that he had started in May, when she had told him to start it, and that had 16 pages already. She said, "It is correctly built." He said, "It is correctly built because you corrected the mistakes." She said, "The mistakes were correct ones to make." She stood. She said, "Now you know the mistakes. Now you know the corrections." She paused. "In the winter you will know the numbers." She paused again. "In spring you will know something that cannot be written in a journal." He said, "What?" She said, "What it is to have been warm when the cold said you should not have been." She said it quietly, the Irish way, the way you said things that did not require volume. She said, "That knowledge changes how you build the next one." He nodded. She walked home across the May prairie, the prairie that was green in the way that Kansas was green in spring before the summer dried it to the amber and brown she had learned to read for water and for soil, and for the specific qualities of her 160 acres that she was beginning in her second year to understand the way she would need 30 years to fully understand them. Behind her, Cormac Daly's structure sat in the spring light, the sod walls already showing the first growth of the new blocks she had helped him lay, the roots beginning their work, the wall beginning its long conversation with the ground. Ahead, her own structure sat in the same light, the north wall, already the thing she had described to Greer in April, the roots growing through the block lines, the grass covering the full north face, the wall that was more like the prairie than like a wall. The wall that the January cold had found, and the January cold had not penetrated, and that the February cold had found, and the February cold had not penetrated, and that the March thaw had found, and that the March thaw was entering now. Greening and growing, the living wall growing more alive with the season. She had 112 pieces of wood stacked against the south face under the oiled cloth. She would not need them until October. October was 5 months away. 5 months was long enough to build the spring structure, the larger room, the sleeping loft, the proper door with the fitted cottonwood threshold. 5 months was long enough to extend the south garden and put in the winter wheat and make the second year of the claim, instead of the second winter. She had survived the first winter. She had survived it in a mound with a door on the prairie, with no chimney and no stove, and 3-foot sod walls, and a sunken floor, and 1 cord, and 3/4 of cottonwood, in a winter that had run -34, and taken the unprepared and left the careful. The careful had been a specific thing in this case. The careful had been the journal and the arithmetic, and the 3 experiments with the vent hole and the flat-face spade in January at -20 degrees, with Thomas Greer watching, and the county cork man who had come off his horse and asked to be shown what to do. The careful was the wall that was alive and improving. She pressed her palm to the south face of the structure as she passed. 58 degrees in April. By October it would be 60. By October of the year after that, 61. The wall was learning what it needed to know. So was she.